Perhaps the best place to start when thinking about fuel poverty is, why are the energy prices rising? And some of the things that I've found to address this are that during lockdowns there was low demand and now demand has increased but supply hasn't, or that there was a very cold winter in Europe last year and that reduced the stored supplies, or that in China they've reduced coal production and are using more natural gas, and so that increased demand has made it scarcer and therefore more expensive. Also in the UK, we're more dependent now on imported natural gas, which means that we don't have the same control over its cost. And another point is the profits and dividends for the companies that take place at every stage from exploration to delivery. Of course, there are probably also political considerations, but I'm not going into those. So in looking at fuel poverty, I'm going to first look at how it's defined, then some of the documentation about the extent of fuel poverty, then some things about the impacts of fuel poverty on people, and then finally looking at some of the actions being taken to alleviate fuel poverty, both short-term and longer-term. In terms of defining it, generally speaking, this applies pretty much across the board. People think about it in terms of fuel costs, the ability of households to pay for the fuel, and the amount of fuel they need. England defines fuel poverty using the low income, low energy efficiency indicator. So there are two elements here. Low income. If they spend the required amount to heat their home, they're left with the residual income below the official poverty line. And then the low energy efficiency part is if the property they're living in has an energy performance certificate rating of D or below. Now they switched to using this low income, low energy efficiency indicator. Previously they had used what's called a low income, high costs indicator. And this particular little bar chart shows for the 2019 data, the number of households that would have qualified as fuel poor using the LIHC and the number that qualify using LILEE. And you can see that the people living in A, B, and C rated properties are by definition excluded from the second bunch, but there are now more people included who are living in houses or dwellings rated band D. So that's an interesting little difference there, and I think they switched in part because of the kinds of actions they are taking to address fuel poverty. I'm not going to talk about all the nations, but Scotland is worth looking at because they're doing things in a different and I think perhaps better way. So they start out by saying they're fuel poor if, after housing costs, more than 10% of their net income is required to pay for their reasonable fuel needs. And that's a fairly normal one. Now, what's reasonable fuel needs? Well, that's based on the World Health Organization's definition of maintaining a minimum indoor temperature of 21 degrees in the living rooms and 18 degrees in other areas for 9 hours a day or 16 hours a day on weekends. And for vulnerable people, it's warmer and longer. In terms of income, Scotland's rules are a bit different. They're only looking at income that's not for a disability or care needs, and they've already taken out childcare costs. And furthermore, they're comparing it to a minimum income standard rather than a standard poverty line. And that is based on a social consensus about what's really required as a minimum for a given set of household circumstances. It's a very different approach and perhaps a better one. I'll show you a bit more in the next slide. So this slide is showing you on this graph what the minimum income standard would be in comparison to the poverty line for the kind of a household that's a single adult with no children. So you can see on this graph, the green line is the median income after housing costs. The blue line at the bottom is what would normally be the poverty line. That's 60% of that median income. But the red line that is in between and doesn't exactly track the other two is the minimum income standard. And it would be quite different for example, a family with 3 children than it would be for a single adult with no children. But it's based on what it really takes to live. In some of these Scottish outlying areas, in fact, they add a bit to the minimum income standard, recognizing that it's more expensive to live in those places. The extent of fuel poverty in England is shown on this figure that came from Ofgem. And with this, if you look on the left, you've got single parents with children, couples with children, multi-person households, etc. And over a quarter of the single parents with children are in fuel poverty. Now, this other thing that's in the middle, called the average gap, that is the amount that you would need to reduce their fuel bills by in order for them not to be in fuel poverty. And that's an average across that 28% of that type of household. So some it's more, some it's less, but that's the average there. Now, looking at the far right-hand side of the figure, you can see here the couples over 60, it's only 10% of that type of household is in fuel poverty, but the average gap necessary to take them out of fuel poverty is over 100 pounds greater than the single parent with children. So it's a complex and multifaceted thing to understand fuel poverty, where it occurs, and what might be necessary to come out of it. In January, the Joseph Rowntree Foundation published a report looking at the impact of the increasing energy bills on different types of families. The top part of this graph here is about low-income families, and that's where we'll focus. The dark bars are what proportion of their income after housing costs is being used to pay for fuel at this time. And when you add on the turquoise bit, that takes it up to what it is likely to be after the cap is raised in April, and the cap will be going up by 51 or 54%. So you can see there's quite a substantial increase. But one of the things that perhaps wouldn't have been obvious in thinking about it is that single adults are the ones who will be hardest hit. In fact, right now, they're the ones who have a larger proportion of their income after housing costs going on fuel at this time. Now, perhaps that's because where there are children and things like that, a lot of the money has to go to other things. I'm not sure what it is, but that's what their data are showing. The impact, as you can see, is substantial across all low-income families, but largest for that particular demographic. Looking at the impacts of fuel poverty, one of the first is the health impacts. And if we look at the impact of having to live in the cold, the medical research shows that negative health effects start to occur around 4 to 8 degrees centigrade. But in England, the threshold for cold weather alerts is 2 degrees centigrade. And so that means that we're going to be having often negative health effects occurring earlier than we get cold weather alerts. The cold weather increases the risk of primarily cardiovascular and respiratory problems. They also reported slips and falls in the snow or ice, but that's not really related to fuel poverty. The fuel poverty, of course, is leading people to keep their heat turned down because it's expensive to run the heat. And the impacts are hardest on older people, very young children, people with serious medical conditions, and people in poor housing or economic circumstances. We had 28,300 excess winter deaths last winter in England, and many of those were related to cold temperatures and living in cold homes. The rate of winter deaths in England, interestingly, is twice that of Finland, a place that's a bit colder than here. Thinking about some of the other impacts of fuel poverty, obviously you've got financial and psychological impacts, and both of those very much are related to stress. On the financial side, people may go into debt, and that can lead them to loan sharks because they don't necessarily be able to walk into the bank and get money. And that can lead to crime and all sorts of serious problems. If they miss rent payments because they're paying for fuel, they can risk being evicted. If they miss paying their council tax, they can risk having the bailiffs in. And on the psychological side, they can experience helplessness, much like we talked about with food poverty, and a real loss of self-confidence. And that's something that impairs your ability to do almost anything, and particularly to get a good job, get a better job. That's really dreadful. But the other thing that can happen is a great deal of anger. And anger, helplessness, those things put together can lead to drink, drugs, or antisocial behaviors. The actions in place to alleviate fuel poverty. Well, let's address the three factors. First, fuel costs. There is the energy tariff cap and the encouragement to switch suppliers. And I've always been puzzled why that's one of the government's primary ways to get people to save on their fuel, but it is. The energy tariff cap applies to people who haven't switched, basically, and are on default tariffs. It was last raised by 12% in October 2021. It's set to rise in April 2022 by 51%. And here is just a breakdown of the default tariff price cap for people on prepayment meters. Now, it's slightly different for people who pay by direct debit or people who pay, what they call standard credit, where you pay your bill when it comes. But you can see that it has varied a bit. It's at a high point right now, and it's going to be going at a much higher point, just imagining this graph going on to after April. The second of the three factors was the ability of households to afford the fuel, their income. And these were addressed in a number of ways. The winter fuel payment, something applying to people of pension age, which is £200 per household, or if somebody in the household is over 80, £300 per household. The warm homes discount, that's available to people on pension credit or certain low incomes. And that's £140 paid to the energy supplier. There's also a Park Homes version of that. There are the cold weather payments. These don't amount to much, just £25 for a 7-day period, and they only come into effect when it's been 0 degrees or below for a continuous 7-day period, and to people who are on certain benefits or getting support for mortgage interest. And then a couple of the new ones, the £200 discount, basically a loan that everybody gets, whether they want it or not, and it will be repaid over 4 years. And I believe the way that's working is they will give the money to the energy companies, and then the energy companies will be repaying it and charging you. So, and then finally, the £150 council tax rebate. And although I've looked at exactly how this is going to work, I haven't found all the details yet. But that goes into effect in April this year. And all properties in band A to D will get a £150 council tax rebate. And one of the things to consider about these last two measures is they are not targeting people in fuel poverty. Yes, they will help them, but there's also an awful lot of it that will be going to people who don't necessarily need it. Perhaps a campaign to say, if you don't need the council tax rebate, contribute it to something to help people who do need some more help with their fuel poverty. I don't know, there's a potential campaign there. Then finally, we've got the amount of fuel required to heat, and that comes along as a function of the energy company obligation, which is boiling down to home heating cost reduction obligation. And I believe that's what's led into what's currently underway right now, which is the Green Homes Grant Local Authority Delivery Voucher Scheme Phase 2. Details are available at heatdevon.co.uk. And it's actually quite a good program. It's up to £10,000 for homeowners or $5,000 for renters. The landlord has to pay a third for, if it's renters, you have to have the landlord's permission and they have to pay a third, but it's in their interest. It's managed by the energy companies and the local authorities. It only applies if you live in a dwelling that has an energy rating of D, E, F, or G, and your income, your gross income for the household is $30,000 or below, or you receive certain benefits. One of the good things about it is you apply for it, and if they decide that you are eligible, then they send somebody out to evaluate what needs to be done, and they arrange for all of the people to come in and do the work, and they inspect the work, and you don't have to do a whole lot, which makes it much easier for people who just don't feel like they can deal with all of that, which is a very good thing. So it seems like a good, generous program, but it doesn't help people pay the bills this month or next month. Right now, the deadline on phase 2, I believe, is the end of March to apply, and I think it's the end of July or June to have the work done. But it's not up to you to make sure the work gets done in time. They make sure the work gets done in time. So it'll be done in time for next winter, for sure. So one of the ways to help alleviate fuel poverty is to make the dwellings more energy efficient so as to reduce the fuel costs. And that makes good sense in the longer term, although of course it's not something that's going to produce immediate results. I found the data, and we can see here for Torbay, Cambridge, and South Hams. This is looking at what percentage of the dwellings in each of these local authorities fall into each of these energy performance ratings. And you can see that across all three, well more than 60%, in some cases almost 70%, of the dwellings are falling into these poorer energy efficiency homes. So perhaps this is a good investment to improve matters. Now, the energy performance certificate shows not only what is the dwelling now, but also includes an evaluation of, what kind of energy performance level could it reach with modifications. These additional bars here, the lower bars, are what it could be if the changes needed were made. And you can see that if the necessary changes were made to all of the properties here, we would end up with no more than, 20%, generally speaking, 20% or fewer of the houses would fall in these lower ranges. And so it would be a lot more energy efficient, but perhaps what's most important is it would save these households a great deal of money. Now you might wonder how much. You can see here that it does save money. For the households that already are relatively energy efficient, the A's, B's, and C's, it's not saving a whole lot. But when we look at those that are less energy efficient, the D, E, F, and G ratings, it's saving a considerable amount in all three of these local authorities, and I suspect across the UK. £269, Torbay, 296 in Cambridge, 356 in South Hams. So there's quite a lot to be said for this warm homes approach. It's not going to help put food on the table this month or next month, but it may well help have food on the table next year. It's a real investment in the quality of people's dwellings, the quality of their life, their energy efficiency, and the climate. So the programs like that are a very good thing. This one is almost gone. Who knows if there will be another one? Periodically, the government's done things to help people make their homes more energy efficient, and lately they haven't been that keen on it. But they do have this requirement that the energy companies themselves have to fund some of this. It's a matter of getting the word out. And we know that the word hadn't gotten out. We've managed to get it out in Torbay just recently, and that's a good thing. But anyway, so that's a sort of long-term action for alleviating fuel poverty. And here are a few of the sources, and I've cited some others as we've gone through.